The deafening crack of a gunshot echoed through the dark alley, cutting through the night like a blade. A figure crumpled to the ground, clutching his chest as blood bloomed across his hoodie. The streetlights flickered above, casting a sickly yellow glow over the scene. "Drop the weapon!" Officer Jared Colton barked, his voice trembling as he leveled his pistol. But there was no weapon. The young man's hands were empty, palms splayed on the damp asphalt in surrender, his breath rattling as he struggled to speak. "Why?" The victim gasped, his wide, pain-filled eyes locking onto Jared's. Jared's chest heaved, the adrenaline pounding in his veins giving way to a gnawing sense of dread. Something about the boy's face, those eyes, that expression, felt eerily familiar. His gun lowered slightly as his gaze darted to the ID card that had fallen from the boy's pocket. It was then he saw it. The name. Isaiah Colton. Jared staggered back, his knees buckling as the world seemed to tilt around him. The boy lying in his blood-soaked hoodie was his son. Imagine the crushing realization, the heart-stopping moment when the man you've sworn to protect is the one you've just harmed. What would you do in Jared's shoes? Would you freeze? Would you flee? Or would you face the most painful truth of all? This isn't just a story. It's a question about morality, accountability, and what it really means to take responsibility for your actions. Now, before we dive deeper, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know, what would you do if you were Jared? How far would you go to make things right? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping stories like this, and stay with us as we unravel the truth behind this devastating twist. Jared sat on the cold curb, his head cradled in his hands, oblivious to the chaos around him. Flashing red and blue lights bathed the scene in an eerie glow as paramedics worked frantically to stabilize Isaiah. The murmurs of onlookers, the crackle of police radios, and the distant wail of sirens blended into a cacophony that felt miles away. All Jared could hear was the echo of the gunshot, the sound that had shattered not only the night, but also his world. Memories surged through his mind, unbidden and merciless. He saw Cynthia's face, lined with exhaustion and disappointment, as she packed her bags all those years ago. "You're never here, Jared," she had said, her voice trembling with frustration. "Isaiah needs a father, not just a paycheck, and I need a husband who's present." At the time, Jared had convinced himself he was doing the right thing. Protecting the city, providing for his family, that was what mattered. But the long hours, the stress, and the constant exposure to humanity's worst had built a wall between him and his family. When Cynthia left with Isaiah, Jared had told himself it was for the best. He would focus on his work and let them find peace without him. But peace never came. The years had only widened the chasm. He had watched from a distance as Isaiah grew up, glimpsing milestones through secondhand stories and occasional photographs. Pride had kept him from reaching out, and fear of rejection had cemented his silence. Now, sitting in the alley where his son lay bleeding, Jared felt the full weight of his failure. How had it come to this? How had he let his son slip so far from his grasp that he hadn't even recognized him? A paramedic shouted, snapping Jared out of his thoughts. "We're losing him! Get that IV in now!" Jared's stomach twisted. The boy who lay on the stretcher wasn't just another victim. He was his son, and Jared might have just killed him. The fluorescent lights of the precinct conference room buzzed faintly as Jared sat at the long table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Across from him, Detective Avery Lawson the wall, her arms crossed, her sharp eyes never leaving his face. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. "Walk me through it again, Jared," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. Jared shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the scuffed table. "I was responding to the robbery call. The suspect fled into the alley. I saw someone there, someone moving. It was dark." He paused, his throat tightening. "I thought they had a weapon. I yelled for them to stop, but they turned toward me, and I fired." Avery's eyebrows arched slightly. "And you didn't see the weapon?" Jared's jaw clenched. "There wasn't one," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Avery exhaled sharply, pushing off the wall. She began pacing, her boots clicking against the tiled floor. "Do you know how bad this looks? No weapon, no immediate threat, and the kid is unarmed? Not to mention—" She stopped, her voice trailing off as her gaze softened just slightly. "Not to mention he's your son," she finished. The words hit Jared like a blow. He nodded mutely, his chest constricting with guilt and disbelief. You're lucky Internal Affairs hasn't already dragged you into a formal interrogation, Avery continued. But they will, and when they do, they're going to dissect every second of this incident. The media is going to tear you apart, Jared. I didn't know it was him, Jared said, his voice cracking. I swear, Avery, I didn't know. Avery stopped pacing and placed her hands on the back of a chair, leaning forward. That doesn't change the facts. You shot an unarmed kid, and whether or not you knew who he was, this case is about to become the biggest scandal this department's seen in years. Jared swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. He knew she was right. The investigation was just beginning, but the storm had already arrived. The sterile white walls of the hospital hallway seemed to close in on Jared as he sat in a chair outside the ICU. Every beat from the machines monitoring Isaiah's fragile condition felt like a countdown, each sound clawing at his fraying nerves. He had barely begun to process the gravity of what had happened when the double doors at the end of the corridor burst open. Cynthia stormed in, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. Her face was a storm of rage and anguish, her eyes red from crying but blazing with fury. Jared stood instinctively, guilt pressing down on him like a lead weight. What have you done, Jared? She demanded, her voice echoing through the quiet hallway. Cynthia, he began, his voice weak and trembling. She cut him off with a sharp wave of her hand. Don't you dare try to explain this to me. She took a step closer, her finger jabbing the air between them. You shot him. You shot our son. How could you? How could you not recognize your own child? I didn't know it was him, Jared said, his voice cracking under the weight of his words. I thought he was. A threat? She interrupted, her tone dripping with venom. That's what you saw, isn't it? A black kid in a hoodie? You didn't see Isaiah. You didn't see a person. You saw a threat. Her words sliced through him like a blade. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. She was right. In that split second, he hadn't seen his son. He'd seen a shadow, a silhouette, something to be neutralized. Cynthia's voice broke as she continued. Do you have any idea what you've done? He's in there fighting for his life because of you. Because you couldn't look past your badge for one damn second. Jared's chest tightened, tears stinging his eyes. I'm sorry? He whispered, the words feeling hollow and insufficient. Cynthia shook her head, her voice trembling. Sorry won't fix this, Jared. Sorry won't bring back the years you've already stolen from him, or me. She turned away, leaving him standing alone in the hallway, drowning in the weight of his guilt. The sterile hum of the ICU filled the air as Jared stood in the doorway, watching Isaiah through the glass. His son lay unconscious, the pale skin of his face almost ghostly against the white sheets. Machines beeped rhythmically, monitoring his pulse and oxygen levels, while a blood-soaked bandage was wrapped tightly around his chest. Jared could still see the boy's face, those eyes wide with confusion just before the shot. It haunted him, that moment, as if the boy had tried to ask why, tried to beg for his life, and Jared had failed to understand. He couldn't help but think about the years he had missed. Years when Isaiah had grown from a child into a young man, a person Jared barely knew. He had seen the boy's face in photographs, watched him play sports from afar through social media, and had heard snippets of his accomplishments through Cynthia. But the connection had always been distant, fractured by his own pride and shame. Jared didn't even know why Isaiah was out that night. He had assumed he was just another kid up to no good, another statistic in a city filled with crime. But now, as Jared pieced together the truth, it became clear that Isaiah had been in that alley for something entirely different. As the hours ticked by, Jared began reaching out to those who might know his son better. He spoke with one of Isaiah's friends, Marcus, who had been the one to arrange the meeting. Isaiah was on his way to that night. He wasn't a thug man, Marcus said, his voice tight with emotion. He was trying to make a difference. He had this community project going on, wanted to help out the younger kids around the neighborhood. He was always talking about giving back. That's who Isaiah was. Jared felt the sting of guilt sharper now, knowing his son wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was someone trying to change things, someone with a purpose, a good purpose. I didn't know, Jared muttered, more to himself than to Marcus. The revelation hit him hard. Isaiah hadn't been in the alley by chance. He had been working towards something bigger, something far beyond Jared's narrow view. All Jared could do now was hope Isaiah would wake up, hope that there was still time to rebuild the relationship he had let slip away, but he feared it might be too late. Jared returned to the precinct late that night, his mind still reeling from the conversations he'd had. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, the weight of his choices pressing down on him like a constant reminder of his failure. He had always told himself that his badge justified everything, the long hours, the missed birthdays, the broken promises. But now, standing in the heart of the department, it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. He had called in sick for the night shift, hoping to find some space to think, to make sense of what had happened. But instead, the more he thought about it, the more it all unraveled. The more he learned about Isaiah, the more he regretted the years he had spent in self-imposed exile. It wasn't just the missed moments. It wasn't just the birthdays, the graduations, or the simple Sunday afternoons he had never been part of. What haunted Jared most was the knowledge that his son had grown up in a world shaped by his absence, shaped by a father who had cared more about the image on his badge than the flesh and blood of his own family. Back in the precinct, Jared found himself staring at the case file. The reports were bleak, an unarmed teenager shot by an officer with no clear explanation. The evidence spoke for itself. There was no reason why Isaiah had been in that alley, no criminal history, no reason to believe he was a threat. Nothing except the color of his skin and the badge Jared wore. Jared's thoughts were interrupted when Avery entered the room, her expression unreadable. "We got the footage," she said flatly, holding up a disc. "Surveillance cameras from a store near the alley." Jared's heart skipped a beat. "What does it show?" Avery slid the disc into the player, her eyes locked on Jared's. The video flickered to life, showing a dark figure turning toward the alley, hands in the air in a non-threatening gesture. The screen froze just as Isaiah looked back, his face clear for a brief moment. Jared's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the boy. It was Isaiah, his son. The truth was undeniable now. There had been no threat, no reason to fire, only fear. And in that fear, Jared had made the most catastrophic mistake of his life. The next morning, Jared sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, his coffee cooling in front of him as he stared at the open case file. The weight of what he had done pressed on him from every angle, suffocating him. Isaiah's face haunted him, his wide eyes filled with confusion and fear just before the shot. He had to do something. He couldn't keep running from the truth. But where could he even begin? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Jared rose slowly, every step feeling like a battle. He opened it to find Avery standing in the hallway, a look of quiet determination on her face. "I've been looking for you," she said, her voice steady but concerned. "We need to talk." Jared stepped aside wordlessly, allowing her to enter. The weight in his chest grew heavier as she crossed the threshold, her presence reminding him of how far he had fallen. Avery took a seat, her eyes studying him. "You're not okay. I can see it, but you've got to face what's coming." Jared didn't respond immediately. He could barely look her in the eye. He knew she was right. He couldn't keep pretending that the truth would stay buried. But the thought of what would happen if it all came out made his stomach churn. He had been a cop for years. His career, his reputation, everything he had built was at risk. "I didn't mean to," Jared finally muttered, his voice cracking with guilt. "I didn't know it was him. I didn't know." Avery leaned forward, her tone softening. "You didn't know, but you still pulled the trigger. And now you have to own that. We can't go back and change what happened, but you can face the consequences." The words stung, but they were true. Jared had spent so many years buried in his own pride, thinking he could control everything, that he'd lost sight of the man he was meant to be. He had a son he'd failed in every way. "I don't know how to fix this," Jared whispered, his eyes welling with unshed tears. Avery's gaze softened, her voice unwavering. "You start by being honest, with yourself, with Isaiah's family, and with everyone who has been hurt by your actions." Jared exhaled shakily, knowing that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and fraught with pain, but it was the only road left to him. He had to confront the man he had become if he had any hope of ever redeeming himself. The days following the incident blurred together for Jared. He avoided the precinct, his guilt chaining him to his apartment. Isaiah's condition remained critical, and every time Jared closed his eyes, he saw his son's face, both the boy he barely knew and the one he had failed. Cynthia had refused to speak to him, and the press had descended, circling like vultures, each report painting Jared as a monster. The world had no mercy for him now, and he knew that. But it wasn't the public's judgment that tormented him. It was the judgment of his son, the one he had shot without hesitation. He hadn't been able to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he relived that night. The confusion, the fear, the split-second decision that had cost a young man his life. It had been a mistake. But no one could see that. Not now, not in the chaos that had followed. The only thing that remained was the truth. And the truth was brutal. Jared had decided to visit the hospital again that evening, knowing full well what he had to do. It wasn't about redemption. It was about taking responsibility for the life he had destroyed. He owed Isaiah that much, even if he could never undo what he had done. He needed to see him, needed to face the consequences, even if they broke him beyond repair. When he entered the ICU, the cold, sterile air felt suffocating. The lights overhead flickered, casting long shadows across the room. Isaiah lay unconscious, connected to machines that kept him tethered to life. The boy's chest rose and fell slowly, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor a constant reminder of how fragile life could be. Jared stepped closer to the bed, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know if Isaiah could hear him, but he had to speak. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry I failed you." His words felt empty in the vast silence of the room, but he had to say them. Just then, the door creaked open behind him, and he turned to see a nurse enter. She stopped short when she saw him. "Visiting hours are over, officer." Jared nodded, unable to speak. He could feel the walls closing in. There was no escaping what he had done, no way to escape the consequences of his actions. All he could do was stand there, broken and remorseful, knowing that redemption, if it ever came, would not be easy. Jared's return to the precinct the next morning felt like stepping into a storm. The weight of the badge that had once been his shield now felt like a shackle, heavy with the knowledge of what he had done. He couldn't escape the looks, the whispers that followed him as he walked down the hall. Every officer in the building knew the story now, the shots fired, the unarmed teenager, and the aftermath. But Jared couldn't escape the truth. He knew what he had to do, but the price seemed too high. Captain Harris was the first to meet him when he stepped into the office. The man's face was grim, his usual authoritative stance replaced by something closer to disappointment. Jared's heart sank. The captain had been a mentor, someone Jared had looked up to, but now he wasn't sure if he could face him. "Jared," Harris said, his voice low, measured, "we've all heard the reports. You know how this looks, and you know the department can't stand behind you if we don't have the truth." Jared swallowed hard. He had known this moment would come, the moment when he would have to make a choice between the badge he had worn for years and the consequences of his actions. But hearing it from Harris, a man he respected, felt like a punch to the gut. "I'll make a statement," Jared said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll tell them everything. What happened? My mistake. You understand what that means, right?" Harris cut in, his voice sharp. "If you admit to this, you're done. The department will strip you of your badge. Your career will be over." Jared nodded, his mind racing. He had never imagined he would come to this point. But there was no other choice. Isaiah had been innocent, and Jared had failed him in the worst possible way. "I know," Jared said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, "but I have to face it. I can't hide from it anymore." Captain Harris studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the man standing before him. Finally, he sighed. "I can't protect you, Jared, but you're right about one thing. You've got to face it." Jared left the office that day feeling like a shell of the man he had once been. There was no undoing the damage, but there was still a chance to do what was right. The road to redemption was steep and filled with uncertainty, but it was the only road left to him. Jared spent the next few days in a haze of exhaustion and guilt. The precinct, which had once felt like home, now felt like a cage. He couldn't escape the stares or the whispers of his colleagues, each one a reminder of the mistake he had made. The burden of his actions weighed on him more than the physical exhaustion he had grown accustomed to in his career. His mind kept replaying the night of the shooting, over and over again, like a relentless loop that never seemed to stop. He had been a cop for 20 years, built a life around the ideals of justice, and now everything he had worked for seemed like it was crumbling. The walls of his world had come crashing down, leaving him standing in the wreckage of his own making. But it wasn't the loss of his career that haunted him the most. It was the loss of his son, the young man he had failed before he had ever even really known him. Jared sat at his kitchen table one evening, the dull light of the overhead lamp casting shadows across his face. His fingers wrapped tightly around the glass in front of him, the whiskey inside reflecting his fractured state of mind. He hadn't spoken to Cynthia in days, and every call he tried to make to her went unanswered. He had no idea how to face her, let alone explain the tragedy he had caused. He had taken so much from her and Isaiah, so much time, so much trust, so much love, and now there was no way to give any of it back. His phone buzzed on the table, and he glanced at the screen. It was a message from Avery. "We've got the trial date. It's time to come clean." Jared's heart skipped a beat. He had known this day would come, the day when he would have to stand before a courtroom, face the consequences of his actions, and admit what he had done. But now that it was here, he wasn't sure if he was ready. Could he stand in front of a room full of people and confess? Could he admit out loud the horror of his mistake? The decision wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Jared knew what he had to do, even if it meant losing everything. He had to face the music, no matter how much it tore him apart. The trial was scheduled for the following week, and Jared could feel the weight of it in every waking moment. The days blurred together as he sat in his apartment, alone with his thoughts, unable to escape the inevitable. He had already made the decision to testify, to face the consequences of his actions, but that didn't make the upcoming ordeal any easier. He spent hours going over the details in his mind, rehearsing his statement, trying to find the right words to explain the unexplainable. How could he make them understand? How could he justify what he had done? He had no excuse. There was nothing that could erase the life he had taken, nothing that could bring back the boy he had failed. The morning of the trial, Jared stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at his reflection. The man staring back at him felt like a stranger, a broken version of the person he once was. His eyes were tired, bloodshot from the sleepless nights, and his hands shook as he adjusted his tie. He didn't recognize himself anymore. He arrived at the courthouse, his heart pounding in his chest, the buzz of the crowd and the camera flashes making him feel like a criminal. The reporters were waiting outside, their questions coming fast and sharp. "Do you regret your actions, officer?" one of them shouted. "What will you say to Isaiah's family?" Jared didn't respond. There was no answer he could give them. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The jurors, the judge, and the families of those involved all waited for the moment when Jared would take the stand. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, judging him for what he had done. But there was no turning back now. When the moment came, Jared stood and walked to the witness stand. His knees felt weak as he sat down, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He could barely look at the families in the front row, especially Cynthia, who was there, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and anger. The prosecutor's voice broke through the silence. "Officer Wright, do you admit to shooting Isaiah Harris?" Jared swallowed hard, the words sticking in his throat. There was no escaping the truth now. He nodded slowly, his voice barely audible. "Yes," he said, his voice cracking. "I shot him, and I am so sorry." The room fell silent, and in that silence, Jared felt the full weight of the consequences of his actions, the consequences of his failure. The days after Jared's testimony felt like an eternity. The trial had ended, and while the legal consequences of his actions were still pending, something more insidious was eating away at him. The weight of his confession was heavier than any sentence could be, and the faces of Isaiah's family, especially Cynthia, lingered in his mind like shadows he couldn't escape. No matter what happened in the courtroom, no matter how much time passed, he couldn't undo the harm he had caused. Jared had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation, though he knew that was just a formality. His badge was as good as gone. The department had made it clear that they couldn't keep a man on the force who had committed such an egregious act, even if it had been a mistake. The public outrage was deafening, and his name was now synonymous with failure, with the violence he had wrought. But it was the silence from his family that hurt the most. He hadn't spoken to his wife in days, and every call he made went unanswered. He didn't expect forgiveness, but he longed for understanding, for the chance to explain. He had been a different man before that fateful night. But how could he explain something so unforgivable? One evening, after spending another day with his thoughts, Jared found himself walking through the city. The familiar streets now felt foreign, as if he were a stranger in his own life. He had lost everything, his career, his family, his dignity. But it wasn't just about the loss. It was the sense of having betrayed everything he stood for, every principle he had once believed in. As he walked past the park, he saw a group of young men laughing and playing basketball. Their carefree joy struck him like a punch to the gut. He had once been like them, full of ambition, full of life. But now he was broken, a shadow of who he had been. A voice cut through his thoughts. "Officer Wright." He turned to see Avery standing by the gate, her expression soft but serious. "It's not over, Jared," she said. "You're still here. You still have time to make things right. But it's up to you how you do that." Jared's throat tightened. "I don't know how to fix this." "You start by being there, for Isaiah, for your family, for yourself," she said. "It won't be easy, but it's the only path forward." Jared nodded, a flicker of hope sparking deep within him. The road ahead would be long, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the darkness. Jared woke up to the sharp ring of his phone, pulling him out of a restless sleep. The hours seemed to blur together these days, a monotonous rhythm of guilt, regret, and fleeting moments of hope. He glanced at the clock. It was still early, but there was no time to waste. It was Avery. "Jared, it's time. The investigation has concluded, and the department's ready to make a statement. They're recommending termination, and you're going to face the board next week. It's over," she said, her voice even but tired. Jared's heart sank. He had known this moment was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud felt like the finality of a sentence he couldn't escape. His job, the badge he had worn for so many years, was now slipping through his fingers. But in the silence that followed Avery's words, Jared realized something else. That in a way, it wasn't just his career he had lost. It was the very thing that had kept him going for so long, his sense of purpose. "I know," Jared replied, his voice steady but heavy with defeat. "I've been expecting this." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Avery spoke again, softer this time. "You've lost your badge, Jared, but you haven't lost everything. You still have the chance to make amends, to be a father to Isaiah, even if it's in a way you never imagined. You still have the power to do the right thing." Jared closed his eyes, the weight of her words sinking in. It wasn't too late to make things right. It wasn't too late to try. Later that afternoon, he found himself outside the hospital once more. The cold wind bit at his skin as he approached the ICU. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Redemption, forgiveness, maybe even a sign that Isaiah would survive this. But deep down, Jared knew the road ahead would be long, filled with pain, confrontation, and atonement. Isaiah was still unconscious, his body fragile, hooked to the machines that kept him alive. Jared stood beside his son, the silence between them heavy with unsaid words. "I'm sorry, Isaiah," Jared whispered, his voice raw. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to make it right, but I'll try." The air in the room felt thick with regret, but for the first time in a long while, Jared didn't feel completely alone. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but he knew it was the only one worth taking. As we reach the end of this heart-wrenching journey, think about the choices made, the lives affected, and the consequences that will echo for years to come. Jared's story is one of redemption, but the road to healing isn't easy. What would you do if you were in his shoes? Would you fight for redemption, or would the weight of your actions be too much to bear? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear how you would handle this impossible situation. If you haven't already, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. Stay tuned, because the most unexpected twists are yet to come.